The rolling barrage made generals weep over their stopwatches when the stalemate of World War I turned the front into a slaughterhouse. The tactic was first tried by Bulgarian artillerymen in 1913 during the siege of Adrianople. The real hell broke loose in 1916 on the Somme River. The concept is cynical and simple. Batteries create a dense wall of explosions in front of their infantry and move them forward in leaps of 50 to 100 yards every few minutes. The soldiers trail behind, literally under an umbrella of cast iron and TNT. It's a terrifying math. Fall behind for a minute, and the enemy will emerge from their dugouts and mow you down with machine guns. Hurry, and you'll catch your own shell on the back of your head. On October 12, 1917, at Bellevue Ridge, New Zealand troops experienced the full charm of this scheme. Rain began to fall. The clay turned to mush. Heavy guns slid, platforms rocked, and shells began to fall directly on the heads of their own men. The infantry was ground to pulp. On the other hand, excessive haste on the artillery led to equally epic failures. On April 14, 1918, near the village of Rie du Venage, British guns unleashed a wall of fire too quickly. Sergeant Arthur Cook later recalled with venom how the German machine gunners simply waited in cover for the roar to pass, emerged, and cold-bloodedly shot down the Somerset Light Infantry fleeing behind them. Trying to rectify the situation, tacticians twisted the situation as best they could. They created a block rampart covering several lines of defense at once, and a box barrage to isolate sectors. In March 1917, the 1st Battalion of the Buffs Regiment trapped German reserves in such a fiery trap. And on June 7, 1917, at Messines, the British staged a ballet of death. 18-pounder guns drove a shrapnel barrage ahead of the infantry, while 4.5-inch howitzers laid a wall of fire 700 yards ahead. But as soon as the war became mobile, this system instantly fell apart. The slightest loss of communication turned mountains of expensive ammunition into useless noise, proving that order existed only on paper in warm headquarters. The simultaneous strike transformed the chaotic artillery barrage into mathematically calibrated mass murder. The previous hours-long shelling of World War I was the height of stupidity. The enemy had time to hear the first explosions, lazily crawl to a dugout, and wait out the storm. Smart heads quickly calculated. 2/3 of shelling casualties occur in the first few seconds. After that, everyone lies on the ground or hides in crevices, reducing the effectiveness of the fire by 66%. Therefore, zeroing must be abandoned, and hundreds of shells must fall on the same spot at the same second, without the slightest warning. This elegant, sadistic scheme was devised by British artillerymen in the parched deserts of North Africa at the end of 1941. To avoid being identified by radio transmissions, battery officers wound their watches using the precise time signals from the BBC radio. No sighting, no noise. Batteries calculated the flight time of their shells, fired at different times, and the deadly iron fell on the heads of the German tankers simultaneously, accurate to within a couple of seconds. The Americans turned this method into an industrial conveyor belt of death. In 1944, General Joseph Lawton Collins introduced specialized fire control centers. These headquarters were filled with stern men, with slide rules and artillery tables. They calculated the ballistics for guns of different calibers, positioned at different distances from the target. Smaller howitzers fired later, heavier guns earlier. Each battery fired precisely at the correct time. The result was always the same. The enemy would sit in silence, and the next moment, their position would instantly become a boiling cauldron of shrapnel and earth. On July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra, the Americans unleashed hell on the German Panzer Lehr Division. More than 1,000 guns fired in a single second. Division Commander Fritz Behrlein later recalled with horror how his defensive lines instantly transformed into a lunar landscape devoid of any sign of life. And on March 13, 1945, at the Remagen bridgehead, the 400th Armored Artillery Battalion spat out over 2,100 shells in a single strike, instantly wiping out the German counterattack. No tactics, no heroics, pure applied mathematics, turning the battlefield into a well-oiled slaughterhouse. The head of the column encirclement was a triumph of naval geometry over blind force in an era when admirals still believed in floating fortresses. The essence of the maneuver is mockingly simple. A column of your battleships passes perpendicular to the enemy squadron's course, directly in front of its flagship's bow. It forms a T, with you forming the upper crossbar. In this position, all your ships slew their guns and fire full broadsides at the head of the column. The enemy seethes with rage, as their ships following behind block each other's view, and only the leader's forward guns can fire. The squadron's entire firepower is reduced to a pair of guns, while a rain of cast iron methodically grinds the enemy's vanguard into dust. In 1905, Japanese Admiral Togo Heihachiro demonstrated this flogging vividly at the Battle of Tsushima. On his flagship, Mikasa, he ambushed a slow, overloaded Russian squadron. The Japanese were adept at reading maneuvers thanks to wireless telegraphy and had 6,000-yard rangefinders compared to the old Russian instrument's 4,000-yard range. Togo calmly banked sharply and trapped the enemy's head column under the broadsides of his fleet. 20 minutes into the battle, the Russian formation disintegrated. The ships darted through smoke, firing indiscriminately, while Japanese destroyers finished off the wounded giants. In 1916, during the Great Battle of Jutland, British Admiral John Jellicoe repeated this feat twice. The German high seas fleet was steaming in tight column, right into the trap. Jellicoe ingeniously deployed his battle line in thick fog, blanketing the Germans with a hail of fire. Admiral Reinhard Scheer realized he was in a deadly trap and saved his ships only by making an emergency 180-degree turn. The British intercepted their course again, forcing the Germans to make a second mad turn under the cover of smokescreens and a suicidal attack by destroyers. Today, these geometrical water games are history. The era of cruise missiles has turned deck artillery into mere decoration, and the tactics themselves have been consigned to the dustbin. For millennia, the pincer maneuver has remained the absolute nightmare of any general foolish enough to believe in the sheer numbers of his herd. The most perfect lesson in this geometric sadism was taught by the Carthaginian genius Hannibal Barca on an August afternoon in 216 BC near the Apulian town of Cannae. The Romans had assembled a gigantic army. 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry marched with the sole purpose of crushing Carthage with sheer force. Hannibal had only 40,000 infantry. A 2-to-1 inferiority in manpower on the open field usually means quick death. But Hannibal read his enemies' minds like an open book. He knew the Roman consuls were thirsty for a quick victory and would drive their legionary battering ram straight through the center. The Carthaginians' plan was mockingly brilliant. He formed his army into a crescent, arched toward the enemy. At the very center of this crescent, he placed his worst fighters, the poorly equipped Gauls and Spaniards. The Romans joyfully struck this living wall. Hannibal's center began to slowly retreat, dragging the triumphant legionaries with it. The crescent first straightened out into a line, then buckled inward, turning into a deep pocket. The Roman infantry crowded, pushing forward and filling this pocket with their bodies. They were so tightly packed that the soldiers literally couldn't swing their swords or raise their shields. At that moment, the trap snapped shut. Fresh, elite Libyan units flanked the Romans, instantly pinning the legion's flanks. Meanwhile, the heavy Carthaginian cavalry, which had previously routed the Roman horsemen, circled the battlefield and delivered a crushing blow from the rear. The encirclement became complete. The crescent became an iron ring, within which a methodical slaughter began. In clouds of dust, under the scorching sun, the Carthaginians hacked down the trapped legionaries for hours. More than 70,000 Romans lay dead on the battlefield, including a consul and 80 senators. Hannibal lost only about 6,000 men. This classic double envelopment scheme has become part of all tactical textbooks, clearly demonstrating that a foolish mob always loses to cold calculation. Burrowing transformed classic urban warfare into a mad parody of rodent life when the infantry finally realized that venturing into the open streets meant quickly getting a lump of lead in the forehead. December 1943. The small Italian port town of Ortona. Canadian lads from the Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders suddenly found themselves turned into living targets. German paratroopers occupied stone houses, raked every intersection with machine guns. The British command's plan to cut the German line here was falling apart. The streets of Ortona became a continuous killing zone, littered with brick rubble. And then, Canadian Captain Bill Longhurst came up with a brilliantly simple idea. If the street kills, then you need to erase the street itself from the equation of movement. They decided to go through walls. The tactics were bizarre and required nerves of steel. The assault team would climb into the attic or top floor of the outermost building. Sappers would attach homemade explosives, packed in tin boxes or anti-tank mines, to the brick wall of the adjacent building. A deafening explosion. A hole just over a meter wide would appear in a cloud of gray dust and mortar. Large enough to crawl through, hunched over. But no one would just crawl through. First, a couple of fragmentation grenades would fly into the breach. As soon as they exploded inside someone's room, the Canadians would rush in with wild cries and shoot the stunned Germans point blank with machine guns. Having cleared the room, they would descend, clear the entire building floor by floor, and then climb back up to blast another hole into the next building. It was an endless, dirty chain of explosions, dust, and hand-to-hand combat in the darkness of strangers' living rooms. This meticulous scramble saved hundreds of lives, as the soldiers never ventured outdoors. They marched through the entire city inside residential areas, turning Ortona into a miniature Canadian Stalingrad. The German paratroopers went crazy. They set up barricades on the roads, mined piles of rubble, and the enemy simply emerged from the walls right behind them. Of course, this underground hell had its risks. Any mistake by a sapper could bring the ceiling down on their own assault team. Moreover, the Germans quickly figured out this trick and began mining the interior walls, setting traps with tripwires. One such explosion buried 20 Edmontonians alive under the collapsed ceiling. Nevertheless, by the end of December, the stubborn Canadians had literally gnawed through Ortona, forcing the elite German division to abandon its impregnable ruins and retreat under cover of night. The dirty communal war has proven that a simple piece of TNT and a hole in the wall work much better than the pretentious tank breakthroughs. A siege has always been a triumph of sheer stubbornness over common sense, with generals willing to starve men for months for a scrap of land. A perfect example of this madness was demonstrated by Julius Caesar in 52 BC at the Gallic fortress of Alesia. The Romans had trapped Vercingetorix's army there, but there was a problem. A gigantic horde of 250,000 warriors was marching to the Gauls' aid. Any normal commander would have fled, but Caesar decided to create a tactical sandwich. His legionaries constructed an incredible double wall. First, they erected an inner ring, a 15-kilometer-long countervallation line, to prevent the Gauls from breaking out. Immediately behind it, they built an outer wall, a circumvallation line, over 21 kilometers long, directed against the outer army of Salvation. The Roman army found itself trapped in a defensive donut between two walls. They fought on two fronts, ate horsemeat, repelled wild attacks from both sides, and won. 2,000 years later, the trench nightmare of World War I drove this idea of defense to the point of utter insanity. Soldiers rotted in the trenches for months. To somehow stir up this morass, headquarters devised trench raids. Small assault groups silently crawled through the slushy mud of no man's land at night. No fanfare or cheers, just knives, brass knuckles, and entrenching shovels. The raiders quietly picked off sleepy sentries, hurled grenades into dugouts, and stole documents. On the way back, they were faced with terrible paranoia, lest their own kind shoot them in the dark. Only a strict password system saved them. They mastered the art of burrowing into the ground. The Germans erected armored domes with slits over their trenches and the Japanese later took the concept of concealment to the extreme by creating single foxholes. These are narrow vertical holes, each designed for one man and covered with a camouflaged lid. An infantryman would walk through the clear grass, and suddenly a hatch would open behind him, and a burst of machine gun fire would erupt from within. To combat such surprises, they invented reconnaissance in force. You simply began randomly spraying lead at any suspicious bushes and craters. If the lurking enemy loses his nerve and fires back, his position is exposed. A second ago, he was an invisible hunter, and now a heavy explosive charge is flying toward him. Defense in depth freed the war from the idiocy of the old command structures, which until the middle of the First World War stubbornly demanded that every centimeter of ground be held. The result was predictable. Crowded forward trenches were obliterated by artillery in a matter of hours. In the winter of 1916, German generals finally used their wits and built the Hindenburg Line. The essence of this cynical doctrine is simple. The forward line is held by only a handful of condemned soldiers, whose only task is to spot an attack in time. The main forces, meanwhile, are holed up deep in the rear, several kilometers away. Advancing soldiers joyfully seize empty front trenches, become exhausted, and stretch their lines, entering pre-targeted killing fields. And while the enemy celebrates a false victory, fresh reserves of the defenders launch a swift counterattack into the disoriented crowd. In this survival geometry, the use of reverse hill slopes is especially important. You hide your tanks and guns behind the hill, exposing only the gun turret. You remain an invisible threat to the enemy until their infantry climbs over the ridge under point-blank fire. Of course, this technique has its downsides. It's completely useless on flat terrain. Furthermore, when attempting to switch from defense to attack, the tank is forced to climb up the hill, shamefully exposing its weak and thin undercarriage to enemy guns. But when you simply need to wear down the attackers, trading space for a while works flawlessly. The greatest triumph of this tactic occurred in the summer of 1943 at the Kursk Bulge. Soviet headquarters used the Germans' own method against them, taking it to the extreme. They created a deep system of defensive zones, averaging 20 kilometers deep, with an insanely dense minefield, with up to 1,500 anti-tank mines per kilometer. The German armored spearheads simply became mired in this web, losing all momentum. If the enemy cannot be stopped, scorched earth tactics are employed. During a retreat, roads, bridges, food supplies, and shelter are destroyed. The enemy is left with only charred ruins, hunger, and cold, turning their offensive momentum into agonizing extinction. The centerpell tactic was born out of pure, animalistic fear for one's own skin. You're moving along a narrow forest path in a tight column. Suddenly, all hell breaks loose ahead. You're pinned down by intense fire, and the enemy outnumbers you 5-1. Running headlong back is out of the question, as you'll be instantly cut down from behind. Standing still is also foolish. It was precisely for such suicidal scenarios that Australian Special Forces devised this elegant method of controlled retreat during jungle warfare. The maneuver resembles a banana peel turning itself inside out. Your entire squad quickly forms a staggered formation in 2 parallel lines facing the enemy. The first 2 soldiers begin firing wildly in all directions, creating a dense wall of lead. Meanwhile, the guy closest to the enemy yells a command at the top of his lungs and takes off. He runs not to the side, but directly in the middle between his comrades, who continue firing continuously. He dashes to the very back of the column, takes up a position a meter beyond the last soldier, reloads his weapon, and starts firing again. As soon as he passes the next soldier, he instantly repeats this deadly feat. One by one, the soldiers roll back through this living corridor. In the Australian Army, this terrifying run is called the Tunnel of Love, because you're racing through a narrow passage right between the guns of your comrades firing. The psychology here is perfectly calculated. The constant roar creates the illusion that fresh forces are arriving. The attackers slow down, trying to figure out how many men are fighting against them. Furthermore, this diagonal movement allows you to maintain a completely open field of fire. If you ran straight back, you'd simply block your guy's view or catch their bullets in your back. This way, you always remain safe under the cover of dense barrage. This trick requires incredible teamwork and hundreds of hours of training on the range. This maneuver became a hallmark of special forces in the second half of the 20th century. During the Vietnam War, American Navy SEALs routinely performed this carousel through dense undergrowth, escaping from superior guerrilla forces. Hollywood directors quickly recognized the maneuver's spectacular appeal. In the final shootout in Tears of the Sun, a squad led by Bruce Willis uses this technique to escape an entire army of pursuers. The same stunt is featured in the iconic bank robbery scene in Heat. But in reality, it's much more brutal, as one stumbling soldier disrupts the entire chain, turning a well-coordinated maneuver into a mere panicked melee. Blitzkrieg transformed the venerable European tradition of trench warfare into a savage, armored pogrom, when staff generals still relied on sturdy concrete pillboxes and wide defensive lines. German strategists in World War II decided to abandon frontal clashes with fortifications. Instead, they concentrated their forces into a single, narrow, all-crushing fist of tanks, motorized infantry, and dive bombers. They didn't attempt to methodically clear the entire front line. They simply punched a narrow hole in it and rushed deep into the rear, sowing panic and destroying headquarters. The front lines constantly shifted, disrupting the enemy's coordination. French and British staff officers simply couldn't keep up with the maps, marking the source of the tons of TNT raining down on them, and this sapped their will to resist. Within this frantic carousel, the various branches of the armed forces had to improvise on the fly. To prevent infantry from trailing behind, they mounted them directly on the tank's armor. Thus, the tank landing force was born. Soldiers rode into battle directly on armored monsters, pressed against the hot metal under the whistle of shrapnel. It was a mutually beneficial alliance of armor and meat. The tank quickly dragged its men toward enemy positions, while the paratroopers, on the move, picked off enemy anti-tank rifle crews that could have burned the vehicle. The soldiers dismounted only at the very last stage of the assault, when only a few meters remained to the enemy trench. The logic here is extremely cynical. Either you ride in comfort under the threat of being blown up along with your ammunition, or you trudge through the mud for kilometers under the aimed fire of machine guns. When it came to approaching on foot, the soldiers used marching fire. No one stood still or aimed at targets through their sights. The infantry advanced in a neat line, firing continuously from their machine guns as they moved. The point of this technique wasn't to kill anyone, but to force the frightened enemy to press their heads into the mud at the bottom of the trench. While the frightened enemy waited for this leaden rain to subside, the assault teams managed to reach their parapet and lob grenades into the dugouts. This was a savage, primal psychological pressure where the density of fire replaced precision. Of course, the expenditure of ammunition was colossal, but a soldier's life in the open field is worth far more than the cheap brass that military factories churn out by the millions per day. Swarming has obliterated the general's centuries-old dream of elegant ranks, proving that a swarm of small, biting creatures is always more effective than a single, lumbering giant. Nature itself has long suggested this pattern. Think of wasps or bees. They have no single commander-in-chief. They operate on simple signals, descending on their target from all sides simultaneously. Military theorists quickly grasped the power of this chaos. In ancient times, the nomadic Scythians turned tactics into a nightmare for heavy legions. Their light horse archers scattered across the steppe, circling the enemy, and relentlessly raining arrows down upon them. Should the column attempt an attack, this swarm would instantly dissolve into dust, only to reappear from the rear a minute later, and continue their tedious, sadistic work. In the 20th century, tactics received a new lease of life due to the vast technological divide. When you can't afford heavy tanks, you have to improvise. During the Iran-Iraq conflict at the end of the 20th century, the Iranians transferred their crews to cheap speedboats equipped with grenade launchers. The huge American ships in the Gulf literally went crazy with these gnats. A large radar couldn't figure out how to target 50 tiny boats hurtling toward you from different directions at breakneck speed. Your formidable gun might blow 3 boats to smithereens, but the other 47 would have time to fire dozens of missiles into your waterline. A similar online frenzy was demonstrated by the London street rioters in 2011. Thousands of teenagers used ordinary smartphones. They instantly learned about police patrols scattered through back alleys and instantly reassembled on the other side of the city for another raid. The police, with their rigid hierarchy, proved completely helpless against this liquid crowd. Today, engineers are completely eliminating humans from the equation. Cheap drones fly in autonomous groups of 150 under the control of a single operator. They distribute targets among themselves. One drone jams frequencies, while another drops like a stone axe on the commander's hatch. The enemy's multi-million-dollar air defense system is simply choking, trying to digest this cheap garbage. The geometry of war has finally degenerated into a cloud of poisonous flies, where the individual bravery of a soldier is worth nothing. Defeating piecemeal turns the enemy's numerical superiority into a mere statistic, proving that a crowd without coordination is nothing more than a pile of fuel for your fire. The essence of tactics is absurdly simple. If you face a massive enemy army, charging head-on is foolish. The strength of any army relies on mutual support. But if you sever communications between enemy units or catch them on the march while they're spread out along the roads, their strength dissipates. You concentrate your entire striking force against one isolated group, quickly destroy it, and then move on to the next. The enemy is dispatched one by one, while their generals at headquarters try to decipher reports. Napoleon Bonaparte made this concept his calling card. In 1796, his 37,000-strong army in Italy faced 67,000 Austrians and Sardinians. On paper, the Frenchman was a lost cause. But he drove his divisions like a wedge between the Allied forces, occupying a central position. While a single screen held off the Sardinians, Napoleon fell upon the Austrian corps with all his fury. The French, their feet bleeding as they moved at breakneck speed, arrived at the right spot before the clumsy enemy could rally. Bonaparte routed them piecemeal in a matter of days, forcing Sardinia to capitulate shamefully. But if you decide to split your forces without forethought, the outcome will be tragic. This is precisely what American cavalryman George Custer proved in June 1876 at the Little Bighorn River. With just over 600 horsemen of the 7th Regiment, he divided his force into 4 parts in front of a Lakota and Cheyenne Indian camp. The chiefs immediately took action. They surrounded and slaughtered Custer's group to the last man, while his battalions, terrified, fired back from the neighboring hills. The universal law of war is harsh. Either you concentrate your fist and strike your enemies one by one, or your name becomes synonymous with shameful disaster. Aerial interdiction emerged when aviators realized the joy of destroying enemy rear areas with impunity, without having to dig through the mud of the front lines. The concept is cynical. You're not striking trenches, but bridges, roads, and supply depots deep behind the front lines. Tactical interdiction strangles specific columns crawling toward the battlefield. Strategic interdiction systematically reduces the enemy's entire infrastructure to the Stone Age. Instead of the usual carpet bombing of cities to intimidate the populace, here, every explosion is directly tied to ongoing ground operations. You're cutting off the oxygen supply. In the spring of 1944, the Allies decided to prove the superiority of this tactic in sunny Italy. They called it, pompously, Operation Strangle, meaning strangulation. The Air Force Command sincerely believed that their pilots would bomb every rail and road north of Rome, leaving the Germans without canned meat and ammunition, and then retreating on their own. Staff officers drew beautiful graphs. They believed that 19 German divisions on the Gustav Line needed 5,500 tons of supplies daily. Cut the rails by 93%, and the Wehrmacht would capitulate. But reality cruelly mocked these armchair calculations. It turned out that German soldiers knew how to fight economically. On the defensive, they only needed 2,500 tons of supplies per day, and German engineers could repair blown-up tracks faster than the Allies could refuel their planes. When the trains stopped, the Germans switched to trucks, harnessed horses, and drove barges across the sea. The diaries of German quartermasters revealed something astonishing. During the strangulation, their stocks of fuel and ammunition in the trenches actually increased. Total collapse. And yet, this aerial flogging worked, but not at all as the generals had planned. When the ground offensive, Operation Diadem, began, the Germans didn't die of starvation, but they were unable to maneuver quickly. The Allies quickly realized they had changed targets and began bombing roads and bridges right at the front line. Mobility plummeted. Panicked, Wehrmacht commanders couldn't redeploy a single battalion to plug the gaps. German reserves simply burned up on the roadsides under the pounding of stormtroopers. In May 1951, the Americans decided to repeat this trick in Korea, launching their own version of Operation Choke. They mapped out 8 routes between 20 and 80 miles behind the front lines. Iron fell from the sky by the ton, turning the roads into moon dust. But here too, the Asian guerrillas ignored high technology, carrying their loads on their backs along mountain trails. Aerial supply hunting proved it once again. Obliterating a bridge is easy. Forcing the enemy to surrender without a single infantry shot on the ground is a task for naive dreamers in command chairs.